I think as Josefina said, everybody is thinking about the economy right now. And I think for women, sometimes we're like, oh my God, the economy, what is that? I mean, how can I possibly understand that? So anybody know where the word economy came from? It's got its roots in a word. Anybody know? It's actually a Greek word that means household management. So when you look at it that way, that's something that women know very well. And whether we're looking at the national budget or our household budget, it's really all the same. It's like you've got to figure out how much you're bringing in and where it comes from, how much you need to go out, what are your expenses, what do you need to spend it on. And then kind of like in the family, you also are looking at who gets what. Like, are you going to send dad on a big golf junket, or are you going to pay for college tuition for junior? And those are the questions that we don't ask that much in our national economy. We look, does anybody know how we measure the economy? What do we
Gross
use?
national
Gross domestic product. And do you know what that measures? It's how much is spent. Yes, all the goods and services that are spent within the economy, that's the number. So if you look at, for example, Hurricane Katrina, was that good for the economy or bad for the economy? Bad. No, it was good for the economy. It was good for the economy because the government, FEMA, injected a lot of money into the situation. But what we don't look at is, how was that money distributed? Who did it go to? So it went to Halliburton, it went to the big companies that were doing security, but it didn't go to the people. So I think that's one thing that we don't think about enough in our society is the distribution of money. It's something we think about in our household, and it's something that we should think about in the national economy. I think I missed one here, but just to say that when we think about our own income, there is still a big gap between men's income and women's income. I think women earn something like 79 or 80 cents to the man's dollar now, which is improved. Some of us remember the song by Sweet Honey in the Rock, 59 cents on every man's dollar. Do you remember that one? So we've gone up a bit since then, but we're still not there. Now, the word wealth, I talk about the racial wealth gap. And in this country, we are totally obsessed with wealth. You know, everybody wants to be wealthy. Everybody wants to be a millionaire. We've got all these TV shows, you know, marry a millionaire, eat weird food so that you can become a millionaire. I mean, everybody's totally obsessed with this wealth. But actually, wealth is important, and it's not the same as being wealthy. Wealth is what you own minus what you owe. Now, this is important. Minus what you owe. So a lot of people think it's just what you own. So if you've got that really nice car, you're wealthy. No. As soon as you buy that car, it depreciates, and you probably owe a lot on it, and you have even less. So we have to be really careful about the fact that we also are carrying debt. And in our country right now, the average household does not save anything. The savings rate has been 0, which contributes to the crisis that we're in. So if you think of wealth or money as kind of like a stream, if you are only relying on income, it comes in at the beginning of the month and it goes out. So I like to say we could just as well call income outgo. And it comes and then out it goes. But wealth is what you have left. It's more like if you get your what you need from a well or a lake instead of from a spring or a little stream that's going right by your house. So you need to have that cushion. As we know right now, people are losing their jobs left and right. If you don't have a cushion, you're not going to be able to weather that economic storm. But it's even more than that. You know, when you think about the American dream, and we all have it, it's kind of what we're brought up with, no matter where we came from or where we got started. What is that dream? Anybody? Home ownership. Having a family. Education. Okay, so the dream is really about having some security for yourself and for your family. And you want your children to do better than you did. That's been a big part of the American dream. So it's about mobility. Well, if you spend everything you have, you're not going to have any money to provide that kind of security and mobility. So wealth is really important. Not being wealthy, but having some wealth, some kind of net worth is really important. And right now, unfortunately, please stand by, we're experiencing technical difficulties. The American dream is on hold for a lot of people. Now, if you look at the distribution of wealth in our country right now, unfortunately, again, the idea of distribution, as we know, we have many, many people that are poor. I think it's something like 1 out of every 8 people in the United States lives under the poverty line. And the poverty line is something like, for a family of 4, $21,000. I mean, nobody anywhere in the country can live on that anyway, and yet 1 in 8 families lives below that line. I cannot even imagine how people survive. Then you look at the other end, and you've got, as you know, we've got billionaires. I mean, billionaires. It used to be $1 million sounded like a lot of money. Now it's like, you got to have a billion. And the difference between $1 million and $1 billion, sometimes it just seems like a zero. But if you look at it this way, if you think of $1 as a second, it takes about 11 days for 1 million seconds to tick away. But it takes 32 years before a billion seconds tick away. So there's a huge difference there. And if we look at the 10 richest people, and actually this is a little bit outdated. The numbers just came out, and they have all lost a fair amount of money. Although, poor things, we're very sorry. So do you notice anything about these people up here? Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Paul Allen, Michael Dell, Lawrence Ellison, Christy Walton, Jim Walton, Rob Walton.
It seems like the Waltons should be on top.
The Waltons did really well. If the Waltons had only one kid, that kid would have been the richest person. Absolutely. Anything around gender?
Yes.
Men. Okay, it's all men. The only women on this list are the Walton daughters. So, so we see that there is certainly a gender lens, but the main thing is you've got Bill Gates and these people that have $51 billion, $40 billion. This was a few years ago. They made a lot of money and they've lost it. So I think they're kind of back around this level. So as you said, poor things. Now, but if we look at the distribution of wealth by race, it's really quite a huge magnitude of difference. So if we look at the income gap, African Americans now make something like 70 cents to the white dollar. So again, there's still a gap, even 40 years after the Civil Rights Movement, we have not bridged that income gap. But if you look at the wealth gap, the net worth of different families, the gap is even huger. So you can see that these are the latest figures, just came out in February. But in 2007, the median white family, so if you took all of the families that are white and you lined them up by the lowest net worth to the highest, and you took the one in the middle, that would be the family with $170,400. But if you did the same thing for African American families, that one in the middle would only have $17,100. So when you look at it that way, it's like there's only a dime of assets compared between blacks and white families. And if you took everybody together, it's about 15 cents. All people of color together, and Asians actually do raise it a little bit. So it's like the gap is about 15 cents. So when I heard this 15 cent number, it reminded me of a little jingle that I heard when I was a kid. I don't know if any of you have heard it, but it went, "Ching Chong Chinaman sitting on a fence trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. Any of you remember that? No? Okay, a few of you heard it. Okay. Well, when I was a kid, people used to say it to me, I suppose because I was Chinese and they thought I would think it was funny. I had no idea what they meant, and I don't think they knew what it meant either. But as I thought about it recently, when I saw these numbers, I was like, oh my gosh, we're still trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. So I can see they're kind of laughing at you because you're working so hard, you're trying to do all the right things, and yet they're sitting there and they've got $1 and you only have 15 cents. So this, just to say that not only is there this gap, and we think now, well, there's a lot of wealthy people of color, so what's the problem? We've got Oprah Winfrey, Robert Johnson from BET, but you'll notice it's true that Oprah is a billionaire, but if you looked at that previous slide where the top one had like $50 billion, she's got $1 billion. She's got peanuts. But then if you go down to the 10th one, he's only got $100 million. So compare that to the $15 billion that each of the Walton kids have, and you can see that there's a huge gap, a huge racial wealth gap, even at the top. Just wanted to mention, too, that as we looked, I mentioned the poverty line, and we measure poverty by income. But we really should be looking at your assets too. What is your wealth? What is your net worth? And the reason for that is, again, you're never going to be able to get out of poverty if you don't have some kind of savings, if you don't have some kind of a cushion. And Josefina mentioned policy and how important it is, and I'm going to talk more about that later. But if you look at the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is really helpful to so many women with children, it's not a lot of money, but it definitely is a little supplement that helps. But across the country, most states have asset limits of only about $2,000. So in order to get that little bit of supplement, you can only have $2,000. Well, you know, if you end up getting a little bit better job, think of all the benefits you lose, and you don't even have that cushion then to help you get by. So in the future, we really have to look at both assets and income together. You really need both. So again, if you look at the asset poverty rates by race, and we define this as not having enough money to last more than 3 months without an income at the poverty level. So you can see that like 43% of African Americans, it's bad enough for whites, 17% couldn't live for more than 3 months without an income, but you know, nearly half of African Americans are in that category, and you've sort of got that, progression of the other groups as well. Now, you know, people will ask though, well, how do you get wealthy? Where does wealth come from? And I like to tell the story in the 20th century, $1 million was enormous, just as $1 billion is enormous today. And one of the first millionaires was John Paul Getty, the oil magnet or whatever that word is. And of course, people would always ask him, like, what is your secret? I mean, I want to become a millionaire too. They were just like us back then. And he said, I have 3 little secrets. One is you have to work hard. Okay, we know that. We all know you got to work hard. It doesn't come for nothing. And then the second thing was, he said, you have to rise early. Okay, I can do that too. And then the third thing he said is, find oil. That was the secret. Well, he was onto something, because the first 2 things are about behavior, and we can all do that. The third one that he mentioned has to do with luck. And there is a lot of luck in our lives. I have to say, you probably know people who, you know, your girlfriends who came from the same background, and some of them are doing a lot better than you are, and some are doing a lot worse, and luck had something to do with it. But there's a question that he didn't ask, and we don't push in our society to ask that question. And that is, where did he get that land that the oil was found on? And what gave him the right to own that land? Just to say, just in terms of the hard work issue too, hard work. Well, the CEO says, yeah, I make $3 million a year. What people don't realize is the hard work and long hours I put in. And you all know, especially immigrant women of color, I worked 3 jobs on my hands and knees for $11,295 a year. I think that was the minimum wage at that time. It came up to about that. Minimum wage does not even bring you up to the poverty level. He must work really, really hard. Then you got this little guy in the corner that said, he delegates the realizing. That's really cute. So, you know, once again, you can work really, really hard, but that doesn't mean you're going to become wealthy. So let's go back to John Paul Getty and his land. Well, they look pretty undocumented to me, say the Native American people. And just to run through really quickly, because it's important to look at all of the different racial groups, because even though the story is a little different for each group, and the mechanism by which they were denied the opportunity to build wealth is a little bit different, the story is the same in that there were obstacles for people of color that were not there for white families. So for Native Americans, the basis really is land. And unfortunately for the Native Americans, they had a different idea about land than Europeans did. They thought that land, since it's not created by people, really shouldn't be privately owned by any people. It's there for the common use, not only of humans, but animals, trees, plants. And so for them, wealth is not about accumulating more and more money. It's about stewarding the land and the natural resources so that they will be productive 7 generations out. Now, the Europeans, though, when they came, they said, no, those stupid Indians, they don't know how to use land. You're supposed to divide it up into little pieces, put fences around it, work that land to death for profit, short-term profit. Now, if we had followed the Native American way of handling the land, we probably wouldn't be in the environmental crisis that we're in today. They were not, they were not using up the land for short-term profit. So a lot of the transfer of wealth between Native Americans and whites has to do with land ownership. And those fights are still going on today, because even the land on reservations was put under the trust of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as if Native Americans were kids that couldn't take care of themselves. So that land was put in trust, and there was a lot of mismanagement of that land, which means Rebecca Adamson, one of the authors of our book, says Native Americans are land rich because they still do have a lot of land, but dirt poor. And the dirt poor is partly because they were denied the right to control what they owned. Here it just says, the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. They shall never be invaded or disturbed. That was in 1787. Shortly thereafter, though, under the pressure of more immigration from Europe, those promises were all broken. And I always like to say, too, you know how there's that saying, Indian giver? It's actually the opposite. It's like the Indians were given rights and land, and yet it was taken away again. So sometimes it seems like things get turned back on the very people that it's being perpetrated on. So of course we know more about the story of slavery, and for African American people, not only could they not own property, but they were someone else's property. And so just like an investment today, if you own slaves, it was like an investment in the bank. That enslaved person brought you more money because of their labor, the work that they produced, but also the children they produced. For women especially, slavery was abolished around the world before it was abolished in the United States. So enslaved women became a production unit. The more children they produced, the more wealth they were producing for their owner. But slavery, sometimes in the North we get all like, that's about them in the South. It was really the economy of the entire country was based on the slave trade. Rhode Island, right next door, that was where the slaves went from. Insurance companies, just the whole big business of the slave trade enriched people from all over our country. So we shouldn't get too smug here in the North and say it was just a Southern thing. Just for the Latinos, particularly Mexican Americans, again, their land was taken from them on a trumped-up war in the 1840s, and in 1848 there was a treaty in which Mexico gave up 2/3 of its land, including New Mexico, large chunk of California, Texas, the rest of Texas was given over to the United States. And since that time, even though, as Henry Cisneros, who was the mayor of San Antonio, said, I didn't cross the border crossed me. But that border is really an artificial line. But now immigration politics are like, when you cross that line, you're illegal or whatever. And we have what we call guest workers, although I think any of us as women who have guests over, we would never treat our guests this way, come in and do the dishes and then kick you back out again. That's not the way you would treat a guest. So, they're needed for agricultural business. They help jumpstart the economy, but once things are going well, they get kicked back across the country. Now, I think the Asian group is really quite interesting because in some ways, it's the clearest in terms of how we constructed race in this country, because when the Chinese first came, nobody knew what color they were, and they didn't know what color they were either, because you didn't define yourself by your color, you defined yourself by your country. So even people from Europe didn't say, I'm white. They said, I'm from France, I'm from Germany, I'm from Ireland, whatever. So in fact, take a look at this picture. It's a marriage certificate from 1884, so this isn't all, this isn't really, really early on. Two people, Patrick O'Malley and his wife, clearly from Ireland, Donegal County, and their race is listed as colored. So when the Irish first came, people weren't clear about what color they were. And for those of you who have lived in England, you probably know that the British hated the Irish even more than they hated the people from West Indies. They were at the bottom of the totem pole. Some people like to say the Irish were the only white people of color. But for the Chinese, they sued to be white because the reason they wanted to be white is the only people who were white could become citizens. And obviously there's a lot of benefits to citizenship. We still see people right now fighting for the right to become citizens here in the United States. But it was decided through court cases that the Chinese, the Japanese, South Asians, each one of those groups over time was ruled by law not to be white. So again, it wasn't obvious from looking. That's not really how race has been defined. But over time, through legal challenges, it has been decided. So for example, when Italians first came here, because they were darker, it wasn't clear whether they were white. Armenians also had to go to court to sue for the right to be white. And they won their case. And because they won their case, they started orchards and vineyards in California and became quite wealthy. Again, if those opportunities had been afforded to Asians, first of all, because they were excluded outright, you just don't see too many until today. There's like a big gap in that history. So just to say, if we're looking at how wealth is created, our government has had a lot to do with it. So for white families, there have been boosts that have been given to hardworking white people, and let's not deny the fact that they were hardworking. Nobody is saying that. But if you were given 165 acres of free land, or for example, Social Security, which was not made available to domestic workers or farm workers, which were the occupations that African Americans and Latinos were holding for the most part. The Federal Housing Administration, which gave low interest loans that were federally subsidized, out of $120 billion, 98% of that went to white families. And you all have heard of redlining, but that's when that whole system started. It was government sponsored, so it was not just mortgage brokers or something like that who were doing it, but it was government sanctioned. So all the way up the line, again, it's like wealth is created by your hard work, plus it turns out boosts from the government. Even protection of property, African Americans and all of these other groups did, in spite of all odds, acquire property. But for example, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a huge and thriving black community. They even had their own Wall Street. They had banks. When it was burned down, the government didn't do a thing. So protection of property is really important too. And we have not all had our property equally protected by the law. So people of color, through a variety of laws that have forbade them from building wealth or not participating in the programs that were available to European families, have not been able to get ahead. They have not been able to ride that ladder into the middle class. So that's the reason for the 15 cents on the dollar. You're standing next to the person and you're both running just as hard, but one is on an escalator and you're on a treadmill, so you're not going to get ahead. So what are the things that we're doing today, though, that do this? Because sometimes people say, well, that was then, that's history, that's over. Although it makes a big difference in terms of generational transfer, because if you look at income, it's kind of like a snapshot of where people are. But if you look at wealth, it's more like a movie. It really started in the past and it keeps on going and will go into the future. If you're doing pretty well, your children will probably do better than you are. And inheritance is one of the biggest predictors of how well you're going to do if your parents were able to pass something on to you. And again, I'm not talking about wealthy. I'm not talking about $1 million inheritance. If your parents were able to even pay for your college education, it's called a transformational asset. That's worth $1 million over a lifetime because of the added earnings that you're going to get, even though it might have been a much smaller amount of investment on those parents. But right now, the government does give a lot of help for asset building. One of them is the home mortgage interest deduction. So if you own a home and you pay a mortgage, you can deduct that from your income taxes. But that goes up to $1 million. So if you buy $1 million home, you can get that deduction. And they don't need it. It's like the original purpose of the home mortgage interest deduction was to allow lower income, sort of lower middle class people to buy a house, and that was an incentive. Now the incentive has been to buy bigger and bigger houses, which has put a pressure on the affordable housing market. If you're a developer, you're going to go where the bigger profit is. So we've built bigger and bigger houses, partly because of the incentives in our tax code. And they say that people were, just trying to
get something for nothing. But here's a guy who said, I'd like to borrow $250,000 to buy a house. The mortgage broker says, I see, how much do you earn? $14 an hour. And you want to borrow $250,000? Are you crazy? You can borrow at least $350,000. So we were really sold a bill of goods. People were really pressured and said, you know, they were told by people, often people they trusted, you know, don't worry about it. The prices, you know, the home values are going up. You're going to do just fine. And now we have the foreclosure crisis that we have. But again, if we're looking at what our government does, for low-income people, we have homeless assistance, public housing, Section 8 in the bar on the left. This was from a couple of years ago, 2005. $24.5 billion were spent for low-income people in direct subsidies. But we forego money in tax collection in the home mortgage interest deduction of $70 billion. So, you know, a lot of that, most of it going to higher income people, because if you're low income and you own a home, you might not even itemize, so you don't get any benefit at all from that deduction. So a way to fix that was we could, as we do in Massachusetts, have a renter's deduction. That would be a way to help lower income people. We could make the home mortgage interest deduction refundable, so that like the EITC, you could get money directly. And we could certainly cap it. Even George Bush's Commission on Taxes recommended that. So I just want to say, and I think that it was touched on by Josefina, that policy makes a difference. If we don't know what the underlying problem is, we're going to pass the wrong policies. So, you know, if you think that the reason that people are poor is only because of their behavior and personal responsibility, and you don't recognize these other things going on, the policies you pass are going to be aimed at changing their behavior, like the marriage incentive. So here's the guy at the welfare office saying, here's some job openings, some rental units, and a list of eligible bachelors. Well, for those of us who've been through a husband or two, we know that's not the answer. So I think for women, I started out by saying, you know, we're kind of like, you know, we don't understand the economy. We think, oh my God, that's too complicated for us. We're just going to like dig in and try to just, you know, manage our own affairs as best we can. But like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, when you pull back the curtain, you find out that there's just some little guy back there pulling the levers, a guy that looks like Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke, you know? And we could be doing the same thing. In fact, we could be doing a better job because we know how to manage our households and we know how to manage money. We've always done it. So there you go.